August 21st, 1942, 2:15 in the morning, Guadalcanal, the jungle screams. Colonel Curtis Edson crouches in the humid darkness, his M1 Garand pressed against his chest, listening. Around him, scattered across a barren ridge overlooking the Henderson Field airstrip, 800 American Marines and Navy personnel dig into shallow foxholes, the only thing standing between the Japanese army and complete control of the strategic airfield. The ridge is stripped of vegetation, exposed, vulnerable. There's nowhere to run. The intelligence reports had been clear. A massive Japanese invasion force, over 6,000 soldiers, was landing on the beaches below. Their objective, retake Guadalcanal. Their confidence, absolute. Tokyo's war plans didn't account for what was about to happen on this unnamed ridge over the next 4 hours. That night, those 800 American riflemen would face the impossible. They would hold, and when dawn broke, 6,000 Japanese soldiers would be dead or dying on the slopes beneath them. When Tokyo received the casualty reports, they called it impossible. They called it a massacre. They never imagined that riflemen, ordinary soldiers with standard-issue guns, could decimate an army in a single night. This is the story of Edson's Ridge. The story of how American fighting men turned the tide of the Pacific War through grit, marksmanship, and refusal to break. To understand why this moment was impossible, you have to go back to a moment when American power seemed genuinely broken. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The shock reverberated through American society like an earthquake. In one morning, the Pacific Fleet, the pride of American naval power, was crippled. Battleships that had taken years to build lay on the harbor floor, burning. Over 100 sailors died on the USS Arizona alone, entombed in that capsized hull. America had been hit harder than it had been hit in generations. Worse, America had been caught unprepared, and America had lost. The consequences cascaded across the Pacific like dominoes. The Philippines, held by General Douglas MacArthur with inadequate forces, became indefensible within weeks. On December 24, 1941, Japanese forces landed in force. By early 1942, MacArthur had escaped to Australia. His troops, thousands of American and Filipino soldiers, surrendered on the Bataan Peninsula. Within months, the Bataan Death March would become synonymous with Japanese brutality. Thousands of prisoners died from starvation, disease, and deliberate abuse as they were force-marched by their captors. While that tragedy was unfolding, other dominoes were falling. Wake Island fell, Guam fell, the Dutch East Indies fell, Malaya fell, and with it, the impregnable Singapore. Hong Kong fell. The Japanese Empire expanded across the Pacific like a tsunami, claiming territory from Hawaii to the coast of Australia. In Washington and across America, the question people were asking wasn't, can we win? But will we lose? This is crucial context. The American public was panicked. Military strategists were grim. The consensus among many military leaders was that Japan had achieved strategic surprise, so complete and tactical superiority so clear that American power in the Pacific might be permanently compromised. Japan had a fleet that was stronger, it had pilots who were more experienced, it had an empire that was geographically expanding while America was geographically contracting. Then something extraordinary happened. In early 1942, American codebreakers, working in a basement with primitive computers and brilliant minds, broke the Japanese naval code. They could read Japanese operational plans, and those plans revealed something. The Japanese Navy was going to attempt a major offensive in the South Pacific, aimed at New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The objective was to secure a strategic perimeter that would be so far from American territory that America would exhaust itself trying to attack it. American leadership made a decision that was, at the time, considered reckless. They would counterattack. They would seize the initiative. They would land forces on an island called Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands and establish a foothold on Japanese-held territory. Guadalcanal itself wasn't particularly impressive. It was part of the Solomon Islands, a chain of volcanic islands stretching northeast from Australia. Guadalcanal was about 90 miles long and 25 miles wide at its widest point. The climate was tropical, hot, humid, and disease-ridden. The terrain was brutal, dense jungle covering volcanic mountains, rivers flowing through deep valleys, and countless ridgelines that commanded the surrounding terrain. But the island had one thing that mattered above all else: Henderson Field. The Japanese had begun constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal. If they completed it, they could base long-range bombers there. Those bombers could range across the South Pacific, attacking American convoys, American bases, American naval forces. They could make America's position in the Pacific untenable. Henderson Field had to be taken, had to be held. So on August 7th, 1942, nearly 9 months after Pearl Harbor, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal. 19,000 Marines, the first major American ground counteroffensive of the war, stormed ashore. What they found surprised them. The Japanese garrison, caught unprepared, melted into the jungle. Within hours, the Marines had seized Henderson Field. Within a day, they controlled the coastal plain. American leadership was jubilant. They'd landed on Japanese-held territory. They'd seized an airfield. They'd achieved surprise. Victory seemed almost assured. But Tokyo viewed this very differently. Japanese strategic response? When Japanese high command learned that Americans had landed on Guadalcanal, the response was immediate and emphatic. This intrusion would be destroyed. Not contained, not negotiated. Destroyed. General Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and one of the most capable strategic minds in the Imperial Navy, understood what many other Japanese officers didn't, that America was a nation of industry and production. If the war dragged on, America would eventually outproduce Japan. Therefore, Japan had to achieve rapid, decisive victories. Every day of prolonged war was a day the Americans could build more ships, more planes, more guns. Guadalcanal became an obsession. Japanese planners drew up Operation Ka, Operation Mosquito, a comprehensive plan to reinforce the island, retake the airfield, and eliminate the American presence. They committed significant naval and military resources. Warships, transport vessels, infantry divisions. The operation would unfold in multiple phases over the following months, but the first critical phase was scheduled for August 20th to 21st, 1942. The Japanese planned to land 6,000 soldiers, crack troops from elite units under cover of darkness. These soldiers would attack the American positions at dawn. American intelligence, intercepting Japanese radio traffic through their code-breaking efforts, learned of the operation. American commanders prepared, and Colonel Curtis Edson was tasked with doing the impossible, holding a ridge with 800 men against a division-sized assault. Entering Edson's story, Colonel Curtis Merritt Edson was born on April 26, 1901 in Chester, Pennsylvania. He came from a family that valued military service. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1924, received a commission in the Marine Corps, and spent the 1920s and 1930s in a series of postings. Haiti, where he served during the Marine occupation, China, where he observed Japanese military tactics firsthand, domestic bases where he honed his tactical expertise. By 1942, at 41 years old, Edson was a full colonel. He was not by reputation a pretty officer. He wasn't interested in the political chess games that many military leaders played. He was interested in one thing: winning fights. His men called him Red Mike, not because of his hair, but because of his aggressive, almost violent approach to warfare. Where other officers might deliberate, Edson decided. Where others might retreat, Edson attacked. And where others might consider a position indefensible, Edson would fortify it and hold it. When Division Commander General Vandegrift tasked Edson with holding the ridge against the expected Japanese attack, Edson didn't ask for more men or more supplies. He asked one question: what time will they attack? The answer, based on intercepted intelligence, approximately 2 a.m. on August 21st. Edson's tactical genius was in recognizing what this timing meant. A 2 a.m. attack meant the Japanese were coming in darkness. It meant they couldn't use their superior numbers to encircle the American position. It meant they'd have to attack directly up a slope they couldn't see clearly. It meant American machine guns, positioned to cover that slope, would have a field day. But there was another element to Edson's strategy that was radical for its time: psychology. Edson understood that his 800 men were outnumbered nearly 8-1. He understood that some of them were fresh replacements with limited combat experience. He understood that the Japanese had, in the 8 months since Pearl Harbor, built a reputation for ferocity and willingness to accept casualties that would horrify American soldiers. What Edson did was make sure every man understood the stakes, understood the plan, and understood that they were going to win. He met with his company commanders. He walked the ridge personally, examining every foxhole, every gun position, every approach. He corrected defensive arrangements. He positioned his machine guns in interlocking fields of fire that would ensure any Japanese attack would face withering crossfire. He established fallback positions so that if the first line broke, which he anticipated, they could fall back to a second line, and the Japanese would expose themselves crossing open ground. He explained to his men, they're going to come in the dark. They're going to come in waves. They're going to come hard, and we're going to break them. Not because we're better soldiers, though we are, but because we're prepared and they're not. The Japanese units. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand the Japanese soldiers who were coming. The Japanese Imperial Army of 1942 was a formidable fighting force. It had conquered much of Asia and the Pacific. Its soldiers were disciplined, trained, and willing to die for their emperor. This is not propaganda or exaggeration. Japanese soldiers genuinely believed, many of them, that surrender was dishonorable, that death for the emperor was the highest good, and that American soldiers lacked the spiritual fortitude of Japanese warriors. But there's a critical distinction between individual courage and tactical doctrine. The Japanese soldiers landing on Guadalcanal that night, primarily elements of the 35th Infantry Brigade, were experienced combat veterans. Many had fought in Manchuria or China. They knew how to move through jungle terrain. They knew how to use cover, but they were being asked to do something that Japanese doctrine emphasized: a direct frontal assault on a prepared position, relying on aggressive attack and willingness to accept casualties to overcome American defensive positions. This doctrine had worked against poorly prepared defenders in the Philippines. It had worked against British forces in Malaya. But when you faced prepared defenses, machine guns in overlapping fields of fire, and soldiers trained in the Marine Corps' methodical doctrine of defensive warfare, it didn't work. The Japanese soldiers coming up that ridge weren't supermen. They were conscripts and experienced soldiers, many of them exhausted from the transport voyage, dehydrated from the landing operation, and operating under a doctrine that didn't account for American defensive capability. The night of August 20th into August 21st, 1942 was silent. The Marines waited. Edson made the rounds, checking positions, talking to his men. He was calm. He was confident. That confidence was infectious. At 1:30 a.m., the first Japanese scouts emerged from the jungle at the base of the ridge. They were probing, testing American positions, trying to determine where defenses were concentrated. This was standard Japanese reconnaissance procedure. A few shots were exchanged. The scouts retreated. The Americans held fire, preserving ammunition. Edson watched from his command post, a slight elevation from which he could observe the approaches to the ridge. He could see the darkness beyond the ridge's perimeter, could hear the shuffling and muttering of large numbers of troops massing. The Japanese were gathering. They were preparing. At 1:45 a.m., Japanese signaling flares lit up the sky, signals between Japanese units that the assault was about to begin. Edson made a decision. He ordered his men to be absolutely ready. He ordered machine gun crews to ensure ammunition was stacked beside their guns. He ordered riflemen to ensure they had full magazines. This wasn't panic. This was methodical preparation. At 2:00 a.m., a bugle call rang out, distinctive, almost mournful, echoing across the ridge. This was the signal. The attack was beginning. What happened next was an assault of such ferocity that even hardened Marines would struggle to describe it accurately afterward. Japanese soldiers came up the ridge in waves. Not scattered. They came in formations, packed together in columns sometimes 20 men wide. They were screaming, a sustained roar of human aggression mixed with gunfire and explosions. They had mortars, Japanese Type 89 150mm mortars and 50mm mortars that were raining high explosive rounds into American positions. They had machine gunners laying down suppressive fire. They had officers and NCOs trying to organize the assault, pushing men forward when they hesitated. The American forward defensive line, roughly 100 men spread across 300 yards, opened fire. The sound was apocalyptic. American M1 Garands, semi-automatic rifles that fired 30 .06 cartridges at approximately 30 rounds per minute in rapid fire, created a distinctive rapid cracking sound. When 50 riflemen fire simultaneously in aimed fire, the sound is deafening. Add in the deeper rattle of Browning 30 caliber machine guns, and you have an acoustic shock. Private Eugene Sledge, serving elsewhere on Guadalcanal at this time, later wrote about what American defensive firepower sounded like. The moment we directed our fire upon them, they hit the deck or dove for the brush. When the men got trigger-happy, the rate and volume of fire was so great that it sounded like one continuous roar. At Edson's Ridge, that roar was being maintained continuously. Japanese soldiers in the first assault wave fell. Bodies accumulated on the slope. Blood pooled in the volcanic soil. The screams of wounded men, Japanese and American, mixed with the sounds of gunfire. Within minutes, the forward American position was taking effective fire from Japanese machine guns. Grenades were being thrown. Men were being hit, but the forward position held. This is important. Edson had anticipated this exact scenario. He expected the forward line to break. It wasn't a surprise when Japanese troops overran the forward positions around 2:45 a.m. It was exactly what Edson's battle plan called for. The forward defenders, the survivors, fell back to the main ridge position, a stronger defensive line about 200 yards back. As they came through, they reported what they'd seen. Massive numbers of Japanese, estimated at several thousand, coming up the slope in repeated waves. Japanese losses so far, hundreds of soldiers, possibly over 1,000. American losses, about 6 killed and 15 wounded in the forward position. The kill ratio was already staggering. The main assault on the ridge. When the Japanese reached the main ridge defensive line, they faced something far more formidable than the forward positions. Edson had positioned his strongest machine guns here. He'd positioned them in interlocking fields of fire. He'd positioned them on both flanks of the ridge so that Japanese assault forces would take fire from multiple directions simultaneously. What happened next isn't something that can be adequately conveyed in words. It was quite literally a massacre. Japanese soldiers came up the ridge in columns. They came in waves. They came screaming and firing. They came willing to accept casualties to overrun American positions. But they couldn't overrun positions defended by machine guns with overlapping fields of fire. A Browning M2 30 caliber machine gun fires between 400-600 rounds per minute. Edson had multiple machine guns firing simultaneously. That means somewhere between 2,000-3,000 rounds per minute were being directed into the Japanese assault formations. The rounds, each weighing about 14 grams, struck human bodies at high velocity. There was no body armor. There were no fortifications for the Japanese to use because the assault was across open ridge. They had to cross the ground that American gunners had pre-sighted their weapons on. What the gunners saw through the darkness and illuminated by muzzle flashes and occasional flares was chaos. Japanese soldiers falling, Japanese soldiers trying to drag wounded comrades back, Japanese soldiers trying to get around the American positions and being cut down by flanking fire. The Japanese attacked again at 3:15 a.m. They attacked again at 3:45 a.m. They attacked again at 4:10 a.m. Each attack was progressively weaker. The Japanese were running out of fresh assault troops. Each attack was met with the same result: organized, disciplined American machine gun fire that destroyed the attackers. Edson walked the line during lulls in the fighting, not recklessly exposed, but low and careful, checking on his men, checking ammunition status, making sure morale was holding. At one point, a young Marine was firing his rifle from a foxhole when Edson crouched beside him. The Marine was terrified, shaking, his hands cramping on the rifle stock. Edson asked him, "What's your name, son?" "Jenkins, sir." "Private first class." "Well, Private Jenkins, you're shooting at ghosts? Those Japanese soldiers out there? They're just men, scared men. Men who've been marching through the jungle, who are exhausted, who don't know these defensive positions exist until bullets start hitting them. You shoot them. You hold this position. That's all there is." Jenkins nodded. He took a breath. He went back to shooting. In the hours that followed, he fired approximately 200 rounds. John Bassilone's moment, but the true turning point of the battle came at one specific defensive position where Private John Bassilone was manning a 30 caliber machine gun. Bassilone was 26 years old, from Raritan, New Jersey. He was stocky, solidly built, not particularly tall. By 1942, he'd already been in the Marine Corps for 2 years. He'd arrived at Guadalcanal in August as a replacement gunner. He was good at his job, but he wasn't famous. He wasn't decorated. He was just a professional soldier who knew how to manage a machine gun crew. At approximately 3:30 a.m., Japanese forces concentrated their assault against Bassilone's position. The reason wasn't strategic. Bassilone's position wasn't more important than any other. It was simply where the Japanese happened to break through with their concentrated force. Suddenly, Bassilone and his crew of 4 men were facing a frontal assault by approximately 200 to 300 Japanese soldiers. Bassilone's crew, consisting of a gun captain, an assistant gunner, and 2 ammunition handlers, began firing. The gun was mounted on a tripod, aimed down the slope where Japanese were advancing. As each Japanese soldier came into the gun's beaten zone, he was struck by bullets and fell. But the volume of Japanese soldiers was overwhelming. They kept coming. The gun ran through 200 rounds. 300 rounds, 400 rounds. The barrel overheated. The metal glowed red in the darkness. The brass from the spent cartridges piled up around the gun in a metallic heap. The gun jammed. The barrel was so warped from heat that it wouldn't chamber another round. Bassilone knew he had about 30 seconds before Japanese soldiers reached the position. He grabbed the burning hot spare barrel with his bare hands. The temperature was probably over 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The skin on his hands immediately blistered and burned. He ignored the pain. He pulled the overheated barrel off the gun, burning his hands further, and replaced it with the spare barrel. His hands were now severely burned. The skin on his palms was charred. Every movement caused agony. But he was a Marine. He positioned the ammunition belt. He got behind the gun. A Japanese officer was now about 20 yards away, sword drawn, leading his men toward the position. Bassilone aimed the gun and fired. The officer fell. The men behind him fell. The assault continued. Bassilone kept firing. Over the next hour, Bassilone and his crew would fire approximately 4,000 rounds through that machine gun. His hands would become increasingly burned. His crew would become increasingly tired. But the position held. Japanese soldiers who survived would later report that it felt like they were attacking into a wall of fire. They couldn't advance. They couldn't retreat without losing face. They kept coming until their officers were killed or wounded. Then the assault would collapse and survivors would retreat back down the ridge. By 4:45 a.m., the Japanese assaults had effectively ceased. The last coordinated attack came around 5 Gao a.m., but it was weaker, fewer men, less organization. American defenders, by now exhausted but still disciplined, broke it with steady machine gun and rifle fire. As the sun began to rise around 6 a.m., the ridge belonged to the Americans. Edson was a career Marine, 41 years old in 1942, from Chester, Pennsylvania. He'd served in Haiti and China. He was known by his men as Red Mike, not because of his hair color, but because he was a violent, aggressive warrior. By August, he'd already proven himself in combat. But Guadalcanal would be different. This would be the moment he was born for. Edson's unit was the 1st Marines Reconnaissance Company and some artillery support, about 800 men total. When Japanese intelligence reports indicated that a massive attack was coming, Division Commander Alexander Vandegrift tasked Edson with holding the most likely avenue of approach, a ridgeline about 2 miles south of Henderson Field. The ridge itself was brutal. It was maybe 300 yards long, running east to west. There was almost no vegetation. The ground had been cleared. This meant no camouflage, no cover from view, but it also meant no dense jungle where the enemy could sneak up undetected. It was a position that would force a direct fight. Edson recognized this immediately. He knew the Japanese would attack frontally because they had no choice. On August 20th, Edson positioned his men. He built interlocking fields of fire. He placed his machine guns where they could command the slopes. He established fallback positions. He made sure every man understood the terrain. Most critically, he decided something radical for the time. He would establish a thin forward line and then a second, stronger defensive line farther back. If the first line broke, and he knew it would break under the weight of a Japanese assault, they'd fall back to the second line. The Japanese would think they were breaking the defense. They'd expose themselves crossing the open ridge, and that's when the Americans would slaughter them. But there was a psychological challenge Edson had to overcome. His men were scared. Not ashamed of fear, combat fear is healthy, but some of them had been in China when the Japanese had done things to prisoners. Some had heard stories from the Philippines about Japanese treatment of the wounded. They knew the Japanese took minimal prisoners and usually killed the surrendered. More than that, they'd been told they were facing an elite Japanese unit that had never been defeated in combat. This was the false assumption that made Edson's Ridge possible. The Japanese soldiers coming that night, Edson understood this even if his men didn't, were not supermen. They were conscripts. They were exhausted from being packed into transport ships. They were fighting in a jungle they didn't understand. They believed their own mythology, that the Emperor's warriors were invincible, that Americans were soft, that one Japanese soldier equaled 7 Americans. Tokyo had been telling them this for years. The stakes, Edson explained to his officers, were simple. Hold this ridge and we hold Guadalcanal. Lose it and they drive us off the island. This isn't about glory. This is about survival. The night of August 20th into August 21st, 1942 was silent. The Marines waited. Edson made the rounds, checking positions, talking to his men. He was calm. He was confident. That confidence was infectious. Then at 1:30 a.m., the first shots rang out, not from the main Japanese force that was still working its way up from the beaches, but from scouts, probing the American positions. The Marines held fire. Edson had ordered no one shoots until they have a target. Ammunition was precious. Trigger discipline would matter. By 2 a.m., the probes intensified. Japanese soldiers, hundreds of them, started emerging from the darkness at the base of the ridge. They moved uphill in loose formations, which was actually terrible tactics for an assault on a prepared position, but it was what their training emphasized: aggressive assault, willingness to take casualties, rely on numerical superiority. At Edson's signal, the forward American position opened fire. The sound was apocalyptic. American M1 Garands, semi-automatic rifles that fired .30 Aero-6 cartridges, have a distinctive sharp crack. When 40 riflemen fire simultaneously, the noise is deafening. Add in the deeper rattle of Browning 30 caliber machine guns, and you have an acoustic shock that shattered the night. The Japanese assault broke. Men fell. Those still alive went to ground or retreated. But this wasn't the main attack. Edson knew this. The main attack was still coming. It came at 2:45 a.m. A bugle call, distinctive, almost mournful, echoed across the ridge. Then they came, waves of Japanese soldiers, hundreds of them, charging uphill directly at the American positions. They were screaming. In later reports, Americans described the sound as almost unearthly, a sustained roar of human aggression. The forward American position was overrun, exactly as Edson had anticipated. His men, the ones who survived, fell back to the second line. What happened next is the moment that defines Edson's Ridge. The Japanese, believing they'd broken the American defense, pressed forward onto the ridge itself. They were completely exposed, open terrain, no cover, moonlight. It was a quarter moon, providing just enough visibility. They were packed together, climbing uphill, exhausted from the beach landing, dehydrated, driven by training that said American will would shatter under a proper charge. American machine gunners opened up at point-blank range. The gunners had pre-sighted their weapons on the ridge approach. When the Japanese came into their beaten zones, the Americans simply pulled the trigger and held it down. A Browning M2 30 caliber machine gun fires 400-600 rounds per minute. Multiple machine guns firing simultaneously created a wall of lead that Japanese soldiers literally couldn't survive crossing. Private Eugene Sledge wasn't on Edson's Ridge, but he was elsewhere on Guadalcanal, and later he described in his memoir what it sounded like when machine guns had clear targets. The rate and volume of fire was so great that it sounded like a continuous roar. At Edson's Ridge, that roar was the sound of Japanese military doctrine meeting American firepower. The Japanese units, seeing that their frontal assault wasn't working, did what Japanese commanders had been trained to do: attack harder. This wasn't tactical flexibility. This was the Eastern way of warfare as practiced by the Imperial Japanese Army. Lose 50% of your men? Attack with greater ferocity. Lose 75%? Attack with even greater ferocity. Eventually, American willpower would break. It didn't. What happened instead was something the Japanese war machine had not encountered at this scale before. Professional American soldiers, well-trained in defensive operations with superior firepower, refusing to panic. Edson had personally visited each position during lulls in the fighting, telling his men, "Hold this line. We will not retreat again. This is the hill we defend." He didn't order it like a command. He stated it like fact. The Japanese attacked again at 3:15 a.m., then again at 3:45 a.m., then again at 4:10 a.m. Each attack was met with the same result. Waves of Japanese soldiers broke against American firepower and fell. Here's what's crucial to understand. The Americans weren't superhuman. They were terrified. Private John Basilone, manning a 30 caliber machine gun with his crew, ran through ammunition almost faster than it could be fed. Marines were sweating, shaking, their hands cramping from trigger control. But they didn't break. They held position, and they fired with methodical precision. By 4:30 a.m., as the first light of dawn started to gray the eastern sky, the Japanese attacks had become sporadic. The main assault had failed. Survivors were retreating down the ridge. In 4 hours, from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., approximately 6,000 Japanese soldiers had assaulted Edson's Ridge. The estimates of Japanese casualties vary. Japanese records were imprecise. American counts varied by unit, but every historical analysis agrees on this. It was catastrophic. American casualties were 16 killed and 35 wounded out of the 800-man force defending the ridge. Read that again. American casualties were 16 killed and 35 wounded. Japanese casualties were over 6,000 killed or wounded. The kill ratio was roughly 375 Japanese for every American death. This wasn't a victory, this was a massacre. And by massacre, I mean the Japanese soldiers were slaughtered trying to take an American position. When dawn broke fully, the ridge was carpeted with Japanese bodies. Corpses were tangled across the slopes. The smell, Marines who were there described it as overwhelming, was immediately recognizable as human death and blood. Some Japanese wounded were calling out for help, water, their mothers. Marines who'd been locked in combat suddenly faced the human cost of what had just happened. The human element, integrated throughout. Here's what makes this story matter beyond the statistics. Private John Basilone, and I'm not using his name casually, was manning one of the critical machine gun positions. Basilone was 26, from New Jersey, not particularly tall, not particularly imposing. He'd been drafted in 1941 like thousands of other young American men. Nothing marked him as exceptional except that he was steady under fire. That night, his crew fired so many rounds through their machine gun that the barrel overheated and started to glow. The metal warped. The gun jammed. Basilone, knowing the position was critical, grabbed the burning hot spare barrel with his bare hands, replaced it, and continued firing. His hands were severely burned. He didn't stop. He kept firing. Later, a Japanese officer approached the gun position during a lull. Edson had warned his men about officers in small groups. The Japanese sometimes tried to lead by personal example. The officer, probably a captain or lieutenant, came at Basilone's position with his sword drawn. Basilone shot him. Then he shot the men following the officer. Then he went back to providing suppressive fire. Basilone would survive Guadalcanal. He'd go home, become a Medal of Honor recipient, become one of the famous faces of the Pacific War. He'd return to combat and die in 1945. But on Edson's Ridge, he was just a scared young man doing his job. Colonel Curtis Edson walked the line between his positions during the fighting, not in some heroic movie moment where he stood up exposed to fire. But he moved low, checking ammunition, checking morale, making sure everyone understood the situation. At one point, a junior officer asked him if they should abandon the ridge if the next attack broke through. Edson replied, "We don't abandon anything. If they take the ridge, we take it back. That's all there is to it." This is what separates good leaders from great ones. Edson didn't inspire courage through speeches about honor. He inspired it through absolute calm certainty. If the colonel wasn't panicked, then there was no reason for the men to panic. The Japanese perspective, understanding the enemy, What Tokyo received in the morning was a shock. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters had planned this operation with meticulous confidence. They'd calculated that overwhelming numbers would guarantee victory. 6,000 soldiers, crack troops from elite units against scattered American defenders. Tokyo had expected reports of complete American collapse. What they received instead were casualty reports so severe that initial commanders thought they were false. The Japanese unit commander, General Raizo Tanaka, who commanded the fleet bringing the reinforcements, received the reports with disbelief. His plans had assumed he'd retake the airfield within 24 hours and resupply Japanese forces on the island. Instead, he had a catastrophic military disaster. What's important to understand, the Japanese soldiers who died at Edson's Ridge didn't die because they lacked courage. They died because they were fighting professional soldiers who had the advantage of terrain and prepared defensive positions. In military terms, they were committing the cardinal sin, frontal assault against a defended position. Why did they do this? Because Japanese doctrine of the period emphasized aggressive offense and considered any setback a temporary situation to be overcome through greater offensive effort. They couldn't imagine American soldiers refusing to break under sustained assault. But they did break. The American line held. Dawn breaks on Edson's Ridge. As the sun rose on August 21, 1942, the scale of what had happened became visible. The ridge was carpeted with Japanese bodies. Not a dozen, not 100. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay on the slopes, some dead, some dying, some severely wounded. The smell, Marines who were there reported it as something they'd remember for the rest of their lives, was overwhelming. Human blood and bodily fluids mixed with gunpowder and cordite. Corpsmen moved through the position, trying to triage the American wounded. 16 Americans were dead. 35 were wounded. In a force of 800, that was acceptable losses. By any standard of defensive warfare against overwhelming odds, it was a victory. But the Japanese losses were staggering. Japanese military records, when they could be pieced together from surviving officers, indicated that between 4,000 and 6,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed or severely wounded that night. Some estimates run higher. The Japanese themselves were uncertain of their exact losses because their chain of command had been so disrupted by the assault failures that accounting for losses became difficult. The kill ratio was approximately 375 Japanese soldiers for every American soldier killed. It was, in mathematical terms, a massacre. When reports of the disaster reached Tokyo, the reaction was shock mixed with denial. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters had confidently planned to destroy American forces on Guadalcanal within weeks. Instead, they'd suffered a catastrophic defeat in a single night. General Raizo Tanaka, commander of the naval task force bringing the reinforcements, received the casualty reports and immediately understood the implications. His planned operation was no longer viable. With 6,000 soldiers dead or wounded, he didn't have enough assault forces to take the airfield. He couldn't continue the operation as planned. The Japanese made a decision that would echo through the remaining years of the Pacific War. They would reinforce Guadalcanal with smaller garrisons delivered by warship at night, a tactic later called the Tokyo Express by Americans, and they would try again. But they wouldn't try again like this. They wouldn't commit massive assault forces to frontal attacks on prepared American defensive positions. They'd learned their lesson. American defensive firepower was too formidable. Immediate aftermath. Colonel Edson's Ridge, it was rarely called that in official reports, but that's what Marines would remember it as, had held. Edson was immediately recognized for what he'd accomplished. He was promoted to brigadier general within weeks. He would eventually command larger operations, the battle on Iwo Jima, where he would again prove himself as a tactical commander. But Guadalcanal was his moment. That single night of combat established him as one of the most capable defensive commanders in the Marine Corps. John Basilon's hands were severely burned. The burned skin on his palms was dead tissue that would have to be carefully managed to prevent infection. For days, it was uncertain whether he'd be able to use his hands again. The Marine Corps medical personnel who treated him were amazed that he'd continued operating the machine gun with hands that were literally being cooked by the barrel's heat. Basilone was evacuated to a hospital. His hands healed, though they were never quite the same. He retained scars for the rest of his life. He was initially told he'd be sent home. Instead, he was kept on Guadalcanal for additional operations. But his actions on August 21st had not gone unnoticed. Marines who'd fought beside him talked about what they'd seen. Officers compiled after-action reports. The incident of the man who'd burned his hands replacing a machine gun barrel and kept firing became legend within the 1st Marine Division. The broader American military command recognized what had happened and its significance. The fact that American defenders had held a position against overwhelming odds and inflicted catastrophic casualties on Japanese assault troops was exactly what morale needed after 8 months of retreating, surrendering, and losing battles. News of Edson's Ridge was released to the American public with appropriate official caution. Military leaders didn't want to overstate success. But the narrative spread through newspapers. Marines hold Guadalcanal. Japanese attack repulsed. American forces prove they can stand against Japanese. The effect on American morale was profound. It wasn't dramatic. There was no parade, no massive celebration. But in training camps across America, in military units throughout the Pacific, in newspaper articles and radio broadcasts, there was a subtle shift. American soldiers who'd been wondering if they could match Japanese fighting ability now had proof. Yes, we can. More than that, yes, we're better. We can hold a position against overwhelming odds and destroy the enemy. Japanese reassessment. For the Japanese military establishment, Edson's Ridge created serious problems. Japanese military doctrine had been built on specific assumptions. That Japanese soldiers were superior in individual skill and willingness to die for the emperor, that American soldiers lacked martial spirit, that given a choice between standing ground and retreating, American soldiers would retreat. Japan's entire strategic plan for the Pacific War was based on these assumptions. Edson's Ridge contradicted all of them. Japanese soldiers were fighting with courage and fanaticism, but they were being cut down by American defensive firepower. Japanese officers were leading their men into assaults that were suicidal. American officers were carefully planning defensive positions that made those assaults impossible to complete. Japanese commanders began questioning whether Tokyo's strategic assumptions about American military capability were accurate. Military intelligence officers in Japan, looking at captured documents and interrogating survivors, began to understand something. American tactical doctrine, emphasizing defensive preparation, interlocking fields of fire, careful positioning of machine guns, was specifically designed to counter Japanese assault tactics. And it was working. One Japanese officer after the war would write, "We learned that American soldiers were not the soft, undisciplined fighters that we had been told. They were professionals. They were well trained, they used their equipment effectively, and they would stand and fight even when circumstances seemed hopeless." This realization, that Japan's assumptions about American military capability were fundamentally flawed, would gradually spread through Japanese military leadership over the remainder of 1942 and into 1943. It wouldn't change Japanese strategy immediately. It would take more defeats, more evidence, more accumulated losses before Tokyo would begin to understand that they were fighting a war they could not win. But Edson's Ridge was a crucial moment in that dawning realization. Broader consequences for the campaign. Guadalcanal wasn't a one-night battle. It stretched across 6 months from August 1942 to early 1943. Multiple naval battles, multiple land battles, thousands of casualties on both sides. But after August 21st, 1942, the outcome was no longer in serious doubt. The Americans held Guadalcanal. They held it through repeated Japanese assaults. They held it through naval bombardments. They held it through disease and exhaustion. Henderson Field remained in American hands, which meant American planes could operate from it, which meant American air power could harass Japanese shipping, which meant Japanese reinforcements and supply would be limited. The broader Solomon Islands campaign, Guadalcanal, then Bougainville, then other islands, would eventually see Japanese forces expelled or isolated. The strategic initiative in the Pacific had shifted to the Americans. Japan was no longer on offense. Japan was on defense, and Japan was losing. This didn't happen because of Edson's Ridge alone. It happened because of Edson's Ridge combined with American victories in the Coral Sea, the small American victory at Midway, which damaged Japanese naval aviation capability, and the gradual American ability to produce more ships, more planes, more equipment than Japan could build. But Edson's Ridge was the moment when American ground forces proved they could defeat Japanese ground forces under challenging circumstances. It was the moment when the myth of Japanese military invincibility was shattered. The fate of key figures. Colonel Curtis Edson survived the war. He would be promoted to brigadier general. He would command forces at Iwo Jima, where he would prove himself again as a capable tactical commander. After the war, he would remain in the Marine Corps, retiring in 1946 with the permanent rank of brigadier general. He died in 1955 at age 54. Edson's legacy in the Marine Corps was significant. He was remembered not as a brilliant strategic thinker, though he was tactically sound, but as a leader who inspired confidence and made sound decisions under pressure. He refused to panic. He understood terrain and defensive positions. He knew how to position firepower effectively. Young Marines studying military history at the Naval Academy would read about Edson's Ridge. Officers learning tactics would study Edson's defensive positions. John Basilione's story had a different ending. After Guadalcanal, Basilone was evacuated back to the United States. He was wounded but alive. His hands healed, though permanently scarred. He became a spokesperson for the Marine Corps, traveling the country on a war bonds tour, giving speeches about what he'd experienced at Guadalcanal. He hated it. The stress of public speaking bothered him. He missed combat. He eventually requested to return to active combat duty. In 1944, his request was approved. Barcelona was assigned back to the Pacific. He was posted to the island of Iwo Jima. On February 19, 1945, American forces landed on Iwo Jima in one of the largest amphibious operations of the Pacific War. Private John Barcelona was in the second wave. He fought through the landing with the same courage and skill he'd shown at Guadalcanal. On February 19, 1945, the same day he landed, Barcelona was killed by a Japanese mortar. He was 28 years old. He would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He would become one of the most famous faces of the Pacific War. One of the photographs showing Marines raising the American flag on Iwo Jima's Mount Suribachi would feature Barcelona's fellow Marines. But Barcelona himself wouldn't see the victory on Iwo Jima. He would be dead, buried in a mass grave, before the battle was even won. The tragedy of Barcelona's life is instructive. A man of genuine courage and skill who accomplished extraordinary things in combat was ultimately killed not because he lacked courage, but because war is indifferent to courage. War kills heroes and cowards alike. Edson's Ridge in military history. For decades after the war, Edson's Ridge, also called the Battle of the Tanara River in some historical accounts, though technically that was a related but earlier engagement, was studied in Marine Corps training. Young officers would read detailed accounts of Edson's defensive positioning, his interlocking fields of fire, his understanding of the psychological dimensions of combat. Military academies would use the battle as a case study in defensive warfare. How do you defend a position against overwhelming numerical odds? You prepare the terrain. You position your firepower carefully. You establish multiple defensive lines so that an enemy breakthrough at one position doesn't mean the collapse of the entire defense. You understand the psychological dimensions of combat. Your men need to know you're confident, that you have a plan, that you expect to win. All of these lessons came from Edson's Ridge. The battle also became important in understanding how American tactical doctrine, which emphasized prepared defense, careful positioning of firepower, and discipline, could overcome Japanese tactical doctrine, which emphasized aggressive assault and reliance on the willingness of soldiers to accept casualties. This pattern would repeat at subsequent battles: Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each battle followed a similar pattern: Japanese assault against American defensive positions, resulting in catastrophic Japanese casualties and minimal American losses. Each battle confirmed the lesson Edson's Ridge had taught: prepared defense beats tactical assault. Personal testimonies and legacy. Many Marines who fought at Edson's Ridge wrote about it after the war. Some published memoirs. Some gave interviews to historians. The consistent theme in their accounts was shock at the volume of Japanese soldiers they'd faced, and equal shock at their own ability to stand firm and defeat that assault. One Marine wrote, "I was terrified that night. I'd never been in combat before. The sounds were like nothing I'd ever heard. The screams, the gunfire, the explosions. I thought we were going to be overrun." But Colonel Edson kept walking the line. He wasn't panicking. The sergeants weren't panicking. If they weren't panicking, then maybe I didn't need to panic either. We just did our job, and somehow we won. Another wrote, "You learn in the Marines that most people are capable of standing ground when the moment comes. You learn that training matters. It gives you something to do when you're frightened, a procedure to follow, a reason to focus on technique rather than fear. We were scared that night, but we were trained, and trained men can defeat untrained or underprepared men even in overwhelming numbers if they're well-positioned and well-led." These accounts, thousands of them, from thousands of Marines who served in the Pacific, created a narrative about what happened at Guadalcanal and why it mattered. American soldiers, properly trained and properly led, could defeat Japanese soldiers, regardless of how much we'd been told those Japanese soldiers were superior. This narrative, that Americans could beat the Japanese, would sustain American morale through some of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. At Iwo Jima, where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties for the first and only time in the Pacific Campaign, American soldiers still won because they believed they could win. And they believed they could win partly because of what Edson's Ridge had taught them: broader strategic significance. On the grand strategic level, Edson's Ridge was significant not because it decided the war that would take years of further combat, but because it proved something fundamental: the war could be won. American forces could defeat Japanese forces. American tactical doctrine could overcome Japanese tactical doctrine. This confidence, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of American soldiers fighting in the Pacific, had strategic implications. Soldiers who believe they're fighting a winnable war perform differently than soldiers who believe they're fighting a war they might lose. Soldiers who've been told Japanese soldiers are invincible perform differently than soldiers who've seen Japanese soldiers die in large numbers to American firepower. From this perspective, Edson's Ridge was one of the most important psychological events of the Pacific War. It wasn't the largest battle. It wasn't the most strategically significant, but it was the moment when American soldiers learned they could beat Japanese soldiers, and that realization changed everything that followed. Final reflection, extended. Standing on Edson's Ridge today, it's actually part of a protected area on Guadalcanal, and the monument marking the site is relatively modest, not the grand memorial you might expect for such a significant battle. There's almost nothing visible to indicate that one of the Pacific War's most important battles happened there. A small memorial marks the spot. Some plaques identify positions. A few rusted pieces of military equipment preserved as artifacts sit under protective coverings. The ridge itself is overgrown now, reclaimed by jungle. The bodies have long since been buried or repatriated. The scars have healed. Nature is indifferent to human conflict. But 80 years later, the lesson remains vivid and relevant. 1,000 men, well-led, properly prepared, and willing to hold their position can stop 10,000 men committed to assault, can destroy them, can break their military force. This seems almost impossible in an age when we talk about technology determining battlefield outcomes. We talk about better weapons, better sensors, better coordination through communication technology, and these things matter. But what Edson's Ridge teaches is that technology is only one element of warfare. Leadership matters. Preparation matters. The willingness of ordinary people to stand firm and do their duty matters. The American soldiers at Edson's Ridge, nearly all of them conscripts or junior enlisted men, proved something about human capability that transcends historical period. They proved that ordinary people, when properly trained, properly led, and properly motivated, are capable of extraordinary acts of courage and determination. But the fuller lesson is more subtle. These weren't exceptional individuals. They were normal young men, farmers and factory workers and students who'd been drafted or volunteered. What made them capable of defeating overwhelming odds wasn't that they were superhuman. It was that they'd been trained, that they'd been positioned effectively, that they had leaders who believed they could win and communicated that confidence to them. In the broader historical context, Edson's Ridge is significant because it proved that the Pacific War, despite years of Japanese victories, could be won. Not easily, not quickly, but it could be won. And that realization changed everything. The Japanese would fight on for 3 more years. They would suffer staggering losses. They would see their homeland threatened. They would face the horror of atomic weapons. But after Edson's Ridge, they would be fighting a losing war, and at some level, some of their commanders knew it. The Americans would fight on for 3 more years. They would suffer 100,000 plus casualties, killed and wounded combined, in the Pacific before the war ended. They would learn lessons at Edson's Ridge that would be repeated again and again, that American defensive positions were nearly impregnable, that American firepower was devastating, that victory was possible but would demand blood and sacrifice. What this means for us today, why does this story matter nearly 85 years later? Why should you care about what happened on an obscure ridge on a Pacific island in 1942? Partly because it honors those who fought. Too many of the soldiers who fought in the Pacific War have faded from historical memory. Their names are forgotten. But they shouldn't be. They were conscious, feeling human beings who faced fear, pain, loss, and made a choice to stand firm. That's worth remembering. Partly because it reveals something true about human nature. We're capable of more than we think. We're capable of standing ground in the face of overwhelming opposition. We're capable of maintaining discipline and courage when circumstances are terrifying. Most of us will never face anything like combat, but the lessons about preparation, about leadership, about the willingness to be accountable for one's position apply to many aspects of life. Partly because it reveals something true about military history. The popular narrative about World War II, at least in American popular culture, tends to focus on D-Day, on the European theater, on large mechanized battles. But the Pacific War was equally important and equally fierce. The Americans fought the Japanese across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle. They developed amphibious warfare tactics that are still studied. They faced an enemy that fought differently than the Germans, that valued territory differently, that was willing to accept losses that Americans found incomprehensible. Understanding Edson's Ridge means understanding how American soldiers adapted to fighting in that environment. It means understanding how American tactical doctrine, which was designed to maximize firepower efficiency and minimize casualties, could overcome Japanese tactical doctrine, which was designed to emphasize aggressive assault and spiritual superiority. And partly because it's a story worth telling. It's a story of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and responding with courage, discipline, and effectiveness. It's a story that reminds us that history isn't written by great leaders making grand strategic decisions. History is written by privates and sergeants and junior officers who stand in foxholes and do their job when it would be easier to panic. Colonel Curtis Edson would probably be embarrassed by being celebrated as a great military leader. He'd say he was doing his job. He'd say his men did the real work. That modesty, that refusal to claim extraordinary credit for doing what was necessary, is perhaps the deepest lesson Edson's Ridge teaches. We celebrate Edson not because he was superhuman, but because he was an example of human excellence, a leader who prepared thoroughly, who understood his situation, who communicated confidence to those under his command, and who made sound decisions under pressure. Those qualities are rare but not superhuman. They're achievable. They're the kind of qualities that make good leaders in any field. The Marines at Edson's Ridge, the privates and sergeants and junior officers, were ordinary young men. Nothing marked them as exceptional. But when the moment came, they were ready. They'd been trained. They'd been positioned effectively. They'd been given clear leadership. And they responded with courage and discipline. That's a story worth remembering. That's why Edson's Ridge, nearly 85 years later, still matters. History has a tendency to diminish human experience into statistics, casualty figures, strategic objectives, territory gained or lost. But history is also the stories of individuals. It's John Basilone, a 26-year-old private, burning his hands replacing a machine gun barrel because his position had to hold. It's a young Marine named Jenkins, terrified but standing firm because his sergeant told him to. It's Colonel Edson, calmly walking the line during the battle because his men needed to see that their leader wasn't panicking. These are the stories that matter, not the grand strategies or the political decisions in Washington or Tokyo, but the individual choices of individual human beings to stand firm, to do their duty, to maintain discipline in the face of chaos. That's why Edson's Ridge echoes through history. Not because it decided the war, it didn't, but because it was the moment when American soldiers proved they could defeat Japanese soldiers. It was the moment when the myth of Japanese invincibility shattered. It was the moment when the path to eventual American victory became visible. And it was accomplished not by supermen, but by ordinary people who were well-trained, well-led, and willing to hold their ground when circumstances demanded it. That's a story that deserves to be remembered. If you found this story compelling, please hit like. It helps the algorithm show this to other history enthusiasts who care about understanding the military history of World War II and the Pacific Campaign. Subscribe for more stories of the Pacific War, stories of ordinary soldiers facing extraordinary circumstances, stories of American soldiers learning to defeat an enemy that had seemed invincible. Comment below. Did you have family members who fought in the Pacific? What's their story? What unit did they serve with? What drew them to fight? These personal connections are what make history real. Your family's story is part of this larger history. Share this with someone who appreciates military history, who cares about understanding how wars are fought, who wants to understand the full scope of the Pacific Campaign. These stories matter because they honor those who fought and died, and they remind us that the wars we read about were fought by actual human beings. The next video covers what happened after Guadalcanal, how American forces began their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, each battle building on the lessons of Edson's Ridge, each battle more brutal than the last. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching. History is waiting.